Isn't it a great day to be a Christian? Open your Bibles to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. In case you've been sleeping or something, there was an election last week. And thankfully, that's finally over. I'm not thrilled with all the results. But still, we're richly blessed to live in a country where we can gather here this morning without fear. I guess I gripe and whine as much as anybody about the government and the way things are run. But when all's said and done, I guess I feel like Will Rogers, who said that he's just thankful we don't get as much government as we pay for. So I guess we need to be thankful that the government's not more intrusive, not doing more to hinder us. But with all the faults, with all the problems with the government, we're still blessed to live in a land where we're free. We can gather without fear. We can freely spread the gospel. We're in the month of November, and our government has set aside a day for Thanksgiving. It's just one day a year. That's not enough. We need to be a thankful people. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning, is being thankful. So look at Luke chapter 12 and read with me beginning in verse 13. And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. And he said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? And he said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not of the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. And he said unto his disciples, Therefore I say unto you, take ye no thought of your life, what ye shall eat, nor for the body what ye shall put on. The life is more than meat, and the body is more than raiment. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which neither have storehouse nor barn, and God feedeth them. How much more are ye better than the fowls? And which of you with taking thought can add to his stature 1 cubit? If ye then be not able to do that thing which is least, why take ye thought for the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not. And yet I say unto you that Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. If then God so clothe the grass which is today in the field, and tomorrow is cast into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O ye of little faith? And seek not ye what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, neither be ye of doubtful mind. For all these things do the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knoweth that ye have need of these things. But rather, seek ye the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. America was the first country to set aside a day of Thanksgiving. We were the first nation to say we need to give thanks to God. And even though some of our more recent leaders have left God totally out of their Thanksgiving message, we're still truly a blessed nation because we enjoy those freedoms. But it's kind of a paradox if you think about what's going to happen in a couple of weeks. We'll spend the day Thursday eating and drinking and sitting around talking about what a great time it is and how blessed we are and how we have more than we could possibly ever need. And then Friday morning, a lot of people will get up before dawn and go line up outside stores and fight with strangers to get more stuff. That's not how things should be. I want you to think back with me, back into the year 1347. 1347, the Black Plague was ravaging Europe. people were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands in the fields and in the cities across that continent. And some people decided that these deaths were being brought about by the Lord, that they weren't pleased with him. And so they started bringing sacrifices, bringing gifts and offerings to the church. They were trying to get back into God's good graces. And so they started going to the churches and monasteries with gold and silver and jewels and taking all these things to try to please God. The people were frantic. But there was this one monastery in a little town in Germany, and they didn't want that to happen. They came to Lübeck, Germany, and they brought their gifts. Well, the monks at the monastery in Lübeck, Germany, wouldn't let them in. They barred the doors, wouldn't let them through the gates into the monastery. And the people still were frantic, so they started throwing the things over the wall. And the monks decided that that's not good. They said, this treasure, this money, that's what's carrying the plague. We don't want that here. So they threw it back over the wall. And the people would throw it in and they'd throw it back out. And this went on for several hours. Finally, the monks got tired of throwing it back out. So they just went back inside the building, and the coins and the jewels and the treasures just piled up out in the courtyard. And according to the story I read, it stayed there for months. Some even say for years, because the monks said that's causing sickness, that's causing death. We don't want anything to do with that pile of stuff. Well, they were right and they were wrong. The stuff wasn't what was carrying the plague. That wasn't what was making people sick. That's not what was killing people. But stuff can kill you. And that's what Jesus is talking about, the danger, the destruction that can be caused by putting our faith in stuff. Go back to our text, Luke chapter 12, verse 15. Jesus said, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesses." Stuff is not what life's supposed to be about. How much stuff we can accumulate is not going to make a difference in our spiritual well-being. In fact, sometimes it can hurt us. And that's what Job was saying. Go back to the book of Job. Job chapter 31. Read what Job said beginning in verse 24. He said, "If I have made gold my hope, or have said to the fine gold, thou art my confidence, if I rejoice because my wealth was great, because mine hand hath gotten much, if I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness, and my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth hath kissed my hand, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, for I should have denied the God that is above." Job's saying, if I put my hope in gold, if I put my confidence in stuff instead of God, then I'm denying God. Job said that shouldn't happen. We shouldn't put our trust, our faith in gold and riches. The New Testament, Paul says basically the same thing. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9. Paul says, "But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition." Paul said the effort to become rich, the desire to become rich, can lead you down the wrong path. Now, that's not saying that being rich is a bad thing. There were a lot of godly men that had a lot of money. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, David, Solomon. All these men had riches. In fact, God blessed them with riches. In fact, God implied in Deuteronomy that if you would do His will, He would bless you financially. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 8. God's talking to His people in Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning in verse 11. And He says this, "Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God, in not keeping His commandments and His judgments and His statutes, which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses, and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through the great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who led thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou shalt say in thine heart, my power and the might of my hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. God said, you do my will. When you go into this land, you're going to get herds, you're going to get gold, you're going to get silver, your riches are going to multiply. Don't forget where that came from. Don't forget that it's God that gives you the strength to accumulate wealth. See, the problem's not wealth. The problem is forgetting where that wealth comes from. The problem is letting wealth take control of your life instead of God being in control. And that gets us back to our text this morning. Go back to Luke chapter 12. Jesus is out teaching, and this man comes up to him in Luke chapter 12, verse 13, and says, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. Now, that wasn't all that unusual back then. A lot of times people would have a disagreement, they'd have a question, and they would seek out the advice of a respected rabbi. And they'd go to that rabbi and say, you tell us what we need to do. But Jesus didn't want to get mixed up in this dispute about money. Well, why would he do that? Why didn't Jesus say, well, here's what you should do, instead of saying, just ignoring him? Well, according to the rest of our scripture, it's because of covetousness and greed. You probably know of brothers and sisters that stopped speaking to each other because of what daddy left, and they didn't get what they thought was their fair share. You may have known of people where some children fought to steal the inheritance from the other kids, and it caused this big problem. Why? Because they wanted it. Covetousness and greed. And that's why Jesus turned to this greedy family member and he started into his lesson. Look at verse 15. Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things he possesseth. And then to illustrate his point, he went into this story about a rich man that had a bumper crop, and he decides to tear down his barns and build bigger barns to hold all of his harvest. Now, is there anything wrong with a farmer having a good crop? No. Is there anything wrong with farmers building bigger barns? No, that seems like the prudent thing to do. If you have more grain than you can store, you need a bigger storage place. What was wrong with what this guy was doing? Look at verse 19. Jesus said to the wealthy man, I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. That's what the wealthy man said, actually. Look at me. Everything's going to be okay. Just relax and enjoy life. Verse 20, God said, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose things shall those things be which thou hast provided? And then verse 21 sums up the matter. So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. What's wrong with this man? Well, his first thoughts were about himself. I'll say to my soul, soul, you have stuff for many years. Just eat, drink, and be merry. In fact, I don't know anything about Greek, but I read that if you go back to the Greek passage, this parable, there are 54 words that make up the entire parable. 18 of those 54 words, 1 out of 3, are either I, me, or my. It's all about the rich man. It's all about him, what he wanted, and what God wanted wasn't anywhere on the radar. What God wanted didn't enter into this man's thoughts. Last week, somebody out in California won a $2 billion Powerball lottery. And I saw some discussion on Facebook, different places, about What would you do if you had all that much money? And people started talking about, well, first they'd pay off all their bills, and then they would take vacations, and they'd buy houses, and they'd buy houses for their friends, and they'd buy all these things to set aside. But I noticed that none of them mentioned giving any to the Lord. They didn't mention, well, I would give this to the church. I would be involved in missions. None of that came up. I used to do an experiment when I was teaching elementary school. I would give kids a piece of paper with a picture of a $100 bill on it. And I said, now, if you had this $100, what would you spend it for? Write it down. The only rule is you got 5 minutes to spend it. Go. And they'd start writing what they would buy with that $100. And when it was over, I said, okay, now it's Sunday morning. We're going to pass the collection plate. I want you to write down how much you're going to put in the collection plate. Well, they'd already spent their $100, and very, very rarely did anybody have any money that they had set aside for the Lord out of their $100. Now, it didn't really matter. None of that money was real. None of that money they were talking about on Facebook was real, because none of those people really won that $2 billion. It wouldn't have cost them a dime to say they were going to give it all to God, because it wasn't real. But the problem is, what are we doing with what is real? Even without the hundreds of millions of dollars, what are we doing with what's real? You may have seen the illustration about the little man and the big man. The little puny guy was talking. He said, whoa, if I were big and strong like you, I'd go out in the woods and find the biggest bear and wrestle him to the ground. And the big strong guy said, there are a lot of little bears out in the woods. Okay? Don't think about what you would do if you could. Think about what you are doing with what you got. I saw this little poem. It said, it's not what you do with $1 million if $1 million were your lot. It's what are you doing at present with the $1.25 you've got. Okay? What are we doing with the blessing that God's given us? The Bible teaches us over and over that there are problems. Look at Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 say this. Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, thy presses shall burst out with new wine. See, there's nothing wrong with having full barns. There's nothing wrong with having big barns that are full, as long as you give your first fruits to God, as long as He comes first. And the rich fool forgot that. He wasn't thinking about God. He was thinking about himself. Well, why do you think the rich fool was thinking about himself? Well, maybe the rest of Jesus' parable tells us that. Go back to Luke 12 and start looking at verse 22. And he said unto his disciples, therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, neither for the body, what you shall put on. The life is more than meat, the body is more than raiment. Go down to verse 32. Fear not, little flock, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Jesus said, don't think about what you're going to eat and wear. Don't worry about it. Don't be afraid. Fear not. And maybe that's what this rich man's problem was. He was afraid. He was afraid that he didn't have enough. He was afraid that he needed to provide for himself. And I believe that's the reason a lot of Christians don't honor God with their possessions, is because they're afraid. Have I got enough set aside? Am I going to be able to take care of myself in my later years? Am I going to have enough to eat? Am I going to have enough to wear? Am I going to have a roof over my head? And I think money is one place where a lot of us as Christians struggle with our faith. I think money can be a barometer of how much faith we have, how much we're willing to give, how much we're willing to help other people with. And oddly, the people that struggle with this the most seem to be the ones that have the most money. Think about it. The people that are most often the last ones to give are the ones that have the most to give. Look at Proverbs again, chapter 30. Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9. This is a very unusual prayer. Proverbs 30, verse 8 says, remove far from me vanity and lies, give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee and say, Who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain. It says, don't let me be poor because I don't want to have to steal to eat. Look at verse 9. Lest I be full and deny thee and say, Who is the Lord? See, if we got too much stuff, we forget about God. We forget about that He's going to take care of us, that it's not our stuff that happens, that helps us, that blesses us. There's a lot of people that trust their money. They trust their possessions. They trust in their bank accounts. And so they don't want to share it with God. But wait a minute, don't rich people have more money than poor people? Well, yeah, they do, but they have different priorities. And Jesus talks about those priorities back in Luke chapter 12. What were the rich man's priorities? Luke 12, verse 19, I will say to my soul, Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So what was the priority of the rich fool? The rich fool. He wanted to eat, he wanted to drink, he wanted to be merry, he wanted to rest, he wanted to relax and enjoy the good life. And he knew that the stuff in his barns could help him do that. And that's where he put his faith. That's where he put his trust. And he didn't think about God. And that's what happens a lot of times to church folks. I mean, we can count how much money we got in the bank. We can see those figures, but we can't see God. Do we have faith that He's there? Do we really believe? I mean, they come to church, we sing and we pray and we take of the Lord's Supper. We talk about how I love Jesus, but then do we really do what God says we need to do? Are we really putting our faith and our trust in Him? Are we putting our faith and our trust in money? A famous millionaire named Andrew Carnegie once said, millionaires who laugh are rare because all their faith is in their stuff and they're afraid they don't have enough stuff. And that's why they're sad. Go back to Luke chapter 12 again. Luke chapter 12, verse 20. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? Jesus said before He told this parable, Take heed, beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not of the abundance of the things which he possesseth. Don't let money be your God. Let God be your God. You trust Him to supply your needs and not your things. One of the most famous Christians of all time was the Apostle Paul. He wrote about half the New Testament. He started churches throughout Asia and Greece and Rome. And this great Christian man wrote a letter to the church in Philippi. Turn to Philippians chapter 4. And see what this great Christian said. Philippians 4, starting in the middle of verse 11, he says, I have learned whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased and how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Verse 13, I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Paul said, I've suffered and I've been blessed through all of it. I realize I can do whatever through Christ that gives me the strength. Now look at the promise he gives down in verse 19. But my God shall supply all your need according to His riches in glory by Christ Jesus. Where's your faith? Is it in God or is it in stuff? Are we as thankful as we need to be? This sermon wasn't meant to shame anybody. In fact, it's not really even about giving. It's a very giving congregation. You're always willing to go to the extra mile. The question is, how thankful am I for what I have? And do I live out my faith when it comes to finances? For example, the Jews weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. 6 days they'd work, on the seventh day they took off. It didn't matter what was happening. It didn't matter if the the crops were in the field and there was a storm coming on the Sabbath, they rested. Can you imagine the example that was to the people round about them, that they had enough faith in God? He was going to provide for them. Even if they didn't work on the Sabbath, they trusted God. Do we have that much faith? Do we trust God with our finances? I've used this illustration before, but I think it helps to point out what we're talking about this morning. In the Old Testament, the Jews were commanded to set aside 10%. They had to give 10% of all their belongings. Now, that was the minimum. On top of that, they had to make grain sacrifices and drink sacrifices and sacrifice sheep or goats or oxen or something. But 10% was the minimum. In the New Testament, that 10% requirement is not repeated. Instead, Christians are commanded to give as we've been prospered. Now, there's still some denominations that teach you got to give 10%. They teach tithing and you got to tithe. But the New Testament doesn't say anything about that. The New Testament says we're supposed to give cheerfully and we're supposed to give as we've been prospered. But does that mean it's okay for Christians to give less? Well, some people say no, that we should give more because we don't have to make sacrifices from our herds and sacrifices from our crops. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. Jesus paid the debt for our sin, so all we have to do is give joyfully, to give as we've been prospered. Some people say we should be giving a lot more than 10% because we don't have to pay for all those other sacrifices. I'm not saying that there's any number established, but let's just think about that 10% as a figure. How well off would you be living if you gave 10 times or 1/10 of what you make to the Lord? Let's look at it the other way. In a little while, we're going to pass this collection plate. Let's say you put $2 in. Would you be willing to live this next week on $20? Or you put $20 in. How well off it would be on $200? Now, some of you would be really, really blessed if you made as much this next week as 10 times what you put in the collection plate. I'm not challenging you. I'm not suggesting that you're not generous. I'm saying, do we understand how blessed we are and how thankful we need to be? God has blessed us richly. To receive all of God's blessings, you need to be a Christian. It's the only life worth living, the only death one would dare to die. If you are a Christian, are you living out your faith in a way that shows that your trust, that your hope, that your encouragement is found in God? If you need to change the way you're living this morning, I want you to do it right now. We stand together as we sing.